The notice came on a Thursday, in late October, slipped under the door of the room Fern Calloway had rented above the cooperage on Briar Lane, in the mill town of Dunmore, Nova Scotia. She almost stepped on it in the gray morning light, still half asleep, her sock feet cold against the bare plank floor. The paper was folded once and sealed with a plain wax circle. No crest, no flourish. Just the flat institutional weight of a decision already made. She opened it at the kitchen table, standing up because she had not yet had a reason to sit down. Miss Calloway, it began. As the tenancy agreement associated with the late Mr. Aldrich Vane was held in his name and not your own, the property at 14 Briar Lane will revert to the ownership of the Dunmore Mill Trust effective November 15th. As a gesture of goodwill, the trust extends a settlement of $40 upon your quiet vacancy of the premises. Please direct any questions to the office of Administrator Haverford Pitts. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table beside the cold teapot and looked out the window. The birch trees on the hill behind the cooperage had already lost most of their leaves. They stood white and bare against the flat gray sky, their thin branches holding nothing. Aldrich Vane had been dead for 6 weeks. We should tell you something about Aldrich Vane, because you need to understand what was being dismissed along with his name from that lease agreement. He was 63 years old when he died, a cooper and woodworker of uncommon skill, the kind of craftsman who had spent 4 decades understanding wood the way a reader understands language. Its grain, its memory, its tendency toward warp and split under the wrong conditions. He had no children of his own. His wife, Rose Marie, had died of fever 12 years earlier, and after that he had lived simply, working long hours in his cooperage, taking on the occasional apprentice when one showed the particular quality of patience he respected. Fern Calloway had come to him at 17. The daughter of a fisherman drowned in the Gulf the previous spring, with no living relatives willing to take her in and a determination so quiet and complete, it was easy to mistake for stubbornness. She had knocked on the cooperage door in the rain and asked if she could learn. Aldrich had given her a square of rough-cut ash and told her to plane it flat. She had worked at it for 4 hours without being asked to stop. He hired her that afternoon. For 5 years, she had learned everything he knew. Barrel making, furniture joinery, the particular mathematics of curved staves and tight iron rings, the art of reading a plank of timber for what it wanted to become. When his eyes began to fail at close distances, she had taken over the finer work, the dovetail joints, the inlay on commission pieces, the careful fitting of hinges and locks. When his hands began to shake in the mornings, she had opened the cooperage herself, stoked the stove, and had the first barrel blank mounted in the lathe before he came downstairs. She had not thought of their arrangement as employer and apprentice for a long time. She thought of it, quietly, as something closer to family. Or the only thing she had that resembled it, he had left her his tools. That was what his solicitor, a soft-spoken man named Rufus Carling, who smelled of pipe smoke and wet wool, had told her when she came to his office on the Monday after the funeral. The tools, the workbench, and the contents of the cooperage. The building itself, naturally, Mr. Carling had said, and the word naturally landed with the gentle brutality of a practical man. The building itself belonged to the Mill Trust, as did the room above it where Fern had lived and worked and been. For 5 years, as close to home as she had ever managed. $40, Haverford Pitts's letter said. As a gesture of goodwill, Fern sat down at the table. She was 22 years old. She had $40 coming to her, the tools of a dead man, and the particular skill set of a woman trained to make things that hold together under pressure. She had no family, no address after the 15th of November, and no letters of recommendation beyond the word of a man who was no longer alive to give it. She got out a piece of paper. On one side, she wrote what she had, the $40. Her own savings, $11.60, accumulated carefully over 3 years of small commissions. The tools, Aldrich's full set of Cooper's tools, his hand planes, his chisels, his marking gauges, the lathe accessories, the shoulder vise, his workbench, which was a masterpiece of practical joinery and would be very difficult to move. 3 sets of patterns for barrel staves in different sizes. A folder of commission designs, some paid, some pending, that technically, she underlined this, technically belonged to the shop, not to the trust. She owned Aldrich's battered spokeshave, the one he had given her on her first year's anniversary in the cooperage, the one he had made himself from a scrap of dogwood, and 2 old bolts, with her initials pressed into the handle with a hot stamp he had made for the purpose. That was not tools, that was something else. She did not write it on the list. Some things were not assets, and were not liabilities, and did not fit into ledgers. On the other side of the paper she wrote what she faced. November in Nova Scotia. Accommodation costs in Dunmore. $4 a week at the cheapest respectable boarding house. $51.60 would last her 3 months if she found no work. Finding work was the problem. The mills employed men. The fishing trade employed men. The cooperatives, there were 3 others in Dunmore, employed men, or wives of men, or men's sons. A young woman alone with a set of tools and a dead man's reputation was not an obvious hire. She could go to Halifax. The city had more options, in theory, but the stage was $12. Accommodation was higher, and she would be one more person without connections in a place built entirely on connections. She stared at the 2 sides of the paper. She was a skilled woodworker. She knew that without pride or doubt, the way you know that water is cold. Aldrich had told her in his last year that she had a finer eye for grain than he had ever had, that her joinery was truer than his at the same age. She had not known what to do with that. She had filed it away as something to think about later. Later had arrived. The problem was not her skill. The problem was the world's reluctance to acknowledge it in a form that paid rent. She folded the paper. She looked at the window again. The birch trees stood bare and patient on the hill. She thought about something Aldrich had told her in her 2nd year, when she had ruined a set of staves by pushing the plane against the grain because she was rushing. He had taken the ruined wood from her hands without anger, turned it over, examined the torn surface. "The wood always tells you what it is," he said. "You have to listen before you push." He had paused. That is true of more things than wood. She had not had a reason to think about it in terms of her own life until now. She had always been the apprentice, responding to what was already set. Now she was standing at the bench alone, and the grain of her situation ran in a direction the world had not planned for her. She needed a different kind of plan. Not a plan that worked within the rules that had been applied to her. A plan that read the material differently. She opened Aldrich's folder of commission designs. There were 14 of them. 2 had been fully paid for goods delivered. 4 were partial deposits on work not yet begun. 8 were letters of inquiry, some with sketches, from customers as far away as Truro and Pictou, who had heard of Aldrich's reputation through the particular slow confidence of word of mouth. One was from a man named Theobald Quince in Cape Breton who wanted a matched set of 6 library chairs, the joints hand-cut, the seats woven in a pattern his mother had used in her home in Scotland. He had not sent a deposit. He had sent a letter of considerable length describing exactly what he wanted, and at the end he had written, "I am told Vane's shop is the only one in the province that would not botch it." Fern read the letter 3 times. Then she wrote back. "Dear Mr. Quince," she wrote, "I am writing on behalf of the workshop of Aldrich Vane, which has continued operations under new management. I have been the primary craftsperson for the Vane shop for 5 years and completed the majority of the fine work during that period. I would be pleased to discuss the commission you described. The work you require is within my abilities and I can provide references on request. I ask that we discuss terms and timeline at your earliest convenience." She did not clarify that she was 22. She did not clarify that she was a woman. She signed it F. Calloway, Vane Workshop. She sealed it and set it aside. Then she made a list of every name in that commission folder, every inquiry that had come through the door in the last year, that she had answered on Aldrich's behalf, every customer she had spoken to, fitted, measured, or consulted. There were 31 of them. She wrote to each one with a similar letter. It took her 3 days. On the 4th day she began looking for a space to work. This was harder. Dunmore had no empty workshops for reasonable rent. The mill company owned most of the commercial buildings along the waterfront, and the rates they quoted her, through Haverford Pitts's office, with what she could only describe as polished contempt, were designed for established businesses with capital, not for a young woman with $11 and a grievance. She looked at a building behind the tannery that turned out to have a collapsed roof. She looked at a space in the back of the ironmonger's that had flooded twice the previous winter and smelled of it. She looked at a room above a tavern on Clare Street that was too small to fit the lathe. On the 7th day, she walked out along the South Shore Road, past the point where the town's tidy facades gave way to rougher land. Scrubby spruce, exposed granite shelves, the rocky curve of the Atlantic coast. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was thinking, and she walked when she thought. She found it by accident. It was a cove landing, sheltered from the main road by a stand of old white spruce, with a low stone building at the water's edge that had once been a fish-drying shed. The boards were weathered silver gray, the door was warped on its hinges, and the windows were clouded with decades of salt fog. but the stone foundation was sound. She could see that from 20 feet away, the way the courses of granite sat tight and level, laid by someone who had known what they were doing. The roof was standing. The floor was packed earth and gravel, raised above the tidal line. She walked around it slowly, running her hand along the foundation. She found a small bronze plaque set into the stone near the northwest corner. The lettering was worn almost smooth, but she could make it out. Estab, 1841. Corthay, fisherman. The Corthays. There had been a Corthay family in Dunmore. She had repaired a chair for old Mrs. Corthay 2 winters ago. She remembered. The woman had mentioned a property dispute with the mill company over something on the South Shore. She had seemed both resigned and quietly furious, the expression of someone who has been in a bureaucratic argument long enough to understand that the argument may outlive them. Fern stood in the cold November wind and looked at the building. It was not a workshop, but it had a stone floor and a roof and walls, and with work, she walked inside and looked up. The structure was sound. The south-facing wall had 2 large openings where windows had once been, facing the cove. The light would be extraordinary in the morning hours. The cove itself was sheltered, which meant the wind noise would be manageable. She could hear the sea, but it was a steady sound, not a battering one. She thought about Aldrich. What he would have said standing here. He would have looked at the light. He would have run his hand along the wall. He would have been quiet for a long time. Then he probably would have said, "The question is not what it is. The question is what it could be made into." She went to find Mrs. Corthay. Vera Corthay was 81 years old and lived in a house on the east side of Dunmore with a view of the harbor and an opinion about everything she had ever observed in her 8 decades in this town, which was considerable. She was small and precise, her white hair pinned tightly, her eyes the particular pale blue of shallow coastal water. She remembered Fern from the chair repair, which she had paid for without comment, but had apparently filed away with approval, because she invited Fern inside without hesitation and put the kettle on. Fern explained what she needed. She did not dress it up. She said she had lost her situation with Aldrich's death, that the Mill Trust had given her $40 in 2 weeks, and that she had the skills and the tools and the commissions to build something of her own if she had a place to build it. Vera Corthay listened without interrupting. When Fern finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the harbor. Then she said, "The Cove property has been in dispute with the trust for 11 years. My late husband began the dispute and I have continued it, primarily because Haverford Pitts has the moral character of a lamprey, and I have always found it useful to give men like that something to be occupied with." She paused. "The property is mine, in fact, if not yet in official record. I can lease it to you for $1 a year. I will provide that in writing. If the trust disputes it, they will have to dispute it through me, and I have had 11 years of practice." She looked at Fern with those pale blue eyes. "Aldrich Vane made me a blanket chest 20 years ago," she said. "It is still in my bedroom. Not a joint in it has moved." She set down her teacup. "If you are the person who has been doing his fine work these last few years, I know what you are capable of. Don't make me regret the $1." Fern signed the lease agreement that afternoon. The next 4 weeks were the hardest she had ever worked. The shed needed the door rehung, the window openings glazed, the earth floor leveled and compacted, and the interior arranged to function as a working shop. She did most of it herself, hiring for one day only the Cooper Street laborer, a large quiet man named Odo Marsh, to help her move Aldrich's workbench down from the cooperage. Moving the bench required 4 men, eventually. It took a full morning and cost her $3 in labor. When it was settled against the east wall of the cove shed, with the window light falling across its surface, Fern stood back and breathed. It looked right. In the wrong building, in the wrong town, in the wrong circumstances, it looked completely right. She installed the lathe on the south wall beneath the big window. She hung the tools in their order along the north wall, the same order Aldrich had kept them. The same logic of size and frequency of use that she had memorized so thoroughly she could reach for a gouge in the dark and find it. She built shelves along the back wall from scavenged lumber, rough but functional, for stock and works in progress. She set the spokeshave on the front corner of the workbench, where she could see it. The first real test of her plan came in the middle of November, before the shed was even fully ready. 3 letters arrived the same week. The first was from Theobald Quince in Cape Breton, agreeing to the commission and enclosing a deposit of $20 with a note that said, "I was told Vane's was the only shop. I assume that is still true." The second was from a furniture merchant in Halifax named Stellan Marsh, who had received one of her general inquiries and wanted to discuss a standing arrangement for small batch production of what he called quality provincial pieces. Side tables, stools, simple case goods, to supply a growing retail trade in the city. The third was from Haverford Pitts. The letter from Haverford Pitts informed her that the operation of a commercial workshop at the South Shore Cove property was in violation of land use agreements currently under dispute, that the leasehold claim of Mrs. Vera Corthay was not recognized by the Dunmore Mill Trust, and that she should cease operations immediately pending resolution of the property matter, or face legal costs she was unlikely to be able to bear. She read all 3 letters at the workbench, in the gray morning light, with the smell of fresh shavings and the sound of the sea coming through the window. Then she got up and went to see Vera Corthay. Vera read Pitts's letter without expression. Then she said, "He sent me one as well. 14 years ago when the dispute first began. Then again 7 years ago. Then again 2 years ago." She folded the letter. "He has never once taken it to a court. Do you know why?" Fern said she didn't. "Because my husband kept exceptionally good records," Vera said, "and I have kept them since. Every deed, every boundary survey, every letter from every official since 1841. If Haverford Pitts takes this to a magistrate, he will lose, and he knows it. The letters are a form of intimidation. They are intended to make people with fewer resources than lawyers decide that the cost of resistance is not worth the effort." She paused. "Are you the kind of person who calculates that the cost of resistance is not worth the effort?" Fern thought about the chair and the cooperage she had planed flat in 4 hours at 17 years old. "No," she said. "Good," said Vera. "Then carry on." She did. The Quince Commission took 6 weeks and it nearly broke her. 6 library chairs, matched, hand-cut joints, the seats woven in a Scottish chevron pattern. She had to teach herself from a diagram in a book she borrowed from the Dunmore Lending Library. The first seat took 2 days. The second took a day and a half. By the 6th, she had it down to 6 hours. The joints she cut in Aldrich's tradition, mortise and tenon, drawboard and pinned, no glue as a primary fastener. Because glue fails and wood doesn't have to. She packed the chairs and straw in a borrowed cart and hired a man to drive them to the ferry landing. Theobald Quince wrote back 3 weeks later. The letter was short. "They are the finest chairs I have sat in. I intend to tell everyone I know." The winter of that first year was particular, in the way all hard seasons are particular. Not dramatic, mostly, but a sustained daily effort that wore at you in ways that were too small to name individually and too cumulative to ignore. There were weeks when the shop was cold enough that the glue stiffened before she could apply it, and she had to work with a small brazier burning beside her to keep the temperature manageable. There were weeks when the light failed so early that she worked by lamplight for the last 2 hours of the day, her eyes aching. There were weeks when the commissions were few, and she ate simply and recalculated her dwindling reserves with the same cold precision she had applied to the original assets and liabilities, looking for the number that meant she had run out of options. The number stayed ahead of her, but not by much. She learned to use the cove itself as a resource. The winter storms left driftwood along the shore, not useful for fine work, but adequate for fuel. The fishermen who landed at the cove occasionally needed small repairs, a cracked oar collar, a wooden cleat, a block that had split in the cold. She did these jobs for modest amounts or for trade, and the trade mattered. Salt fish, preserved vegetables, a dressed rabbit once, practical things that kept the food supply from being entirely a cash problem. She kept notes in the margins of Aldrich's commission folder, the same folder she had read in the old room above the cooperage. November 28, split payment received from Stellan Marsh for 8 stools, $14. December 3, oar, collar repair for Ed from the Cove Landing trade, 2 salt mackerel and a bag of turnip. December 11, began Quince chairs. The folder was becoming a record of her own, layered over Aldrich's original entries, the 2 sets of handwriting interleaved. It was not a journal. She did not think of it that way. It was a log of what had been done, what was owed, what had been paid, what remained. It was the language of staying afloat. In late February, when the worst of the cold had passed but the gray had not, Stellan Marsh came down from Halifax. He arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, a well-dressed man in his early 50s who looked at the cove shed with an expression she couldn't immediately read, then looked at the work on her bench with an expression she could read perfectly well. He stayed for 2 hours. He examined the stools she had made him, joints, finish, proportions. He sat in a rocking chair she had built on spec from a piece of figured maple she had found at a yard sale in the autumn. He looked at the folder of designs. He picked up a half-finished side table and looked at the underside, where no customer would ever see and where, therefore, the quality of the work was most honest. He set it down. I have been in this trade for 22 years, he said. I know the difference between something produced and something made. He looked at her directly. Who taught you? Aldrich Vane, she said. He nodded slowly. I bought a blanket chest from Vane years ago. Still have it. He paused. I want to propose a formal arrangement. I will guarantee you a minimum monthly purchase, provided you can maintain quality and deadlines. The amount I have in mind is enough to cover your fixed costs with something left over. He named a figure. Fern kept her face quiet, the way Aldrich had taught her, not by suppressing the feeling, but by understanding that the feeling and the transaction were separate things. That's acceptable, she said. She did not tell him that the figure he had named was more than she had expected. She did not tell him that it would allow her, for the first time since October, to stop recalculating the liability column every morning. She shook his hand and offered him tea, and they sat in the cold shed looking out at the cove while she wrote out the basic terms. Word in a small town moves the way weather does, invisibly, until you notice it has changed. The furniture merchant's arrangement was not a secret. Fern had no reason to keep it one. Stellan Marsh mentioned the workshop in Halifax to customers. Theobald Quince, a man of apparently excellent social connections in Cape Breton, mentioned the chairs to everyone who came to his library. Vera Corthay mentioned the workshop to every person she encountered in Dunmore, which amounted to most of the town's permanent residents, because Vera had outlived the social boundaries that constrained younger people and now simply spoke to whoever interested her. By early spring, people had begun to find their way to the cove shed. The first to come looking for her specifically were a couple who had recently inherited a farmhouse outside Dunmore and needed a kitchen cabinet built to fit an awkward alcove. Fern measured the space, drew a design at the workbench while they watched, answered their questions, and gave them a price. They accepted it without negotiating. She later learned that the wife had told her sister the workshop was the most professional place I've been in that wasn't actually a proper business. A description Fern found entirely accurate. Others followed. A clergyman with a damaged pew that needed skilled repair. A librarian who wanted a custom case for a collection of oversized maps. A man from the South Shore who ran a small hotel and needed 6 bed frames built to a particular specification, simple but solid, the kind that would take guest abuse without complaint. Fern did not tell any of them that she was 22. It did not come up. What came up was the work on the bench, and the work answered the question before it was asked. She began to take on small repair and restoration work as well. Things people brought to her from attics and barns. An 18th century blanket box, with a broken hinge and a split panel, a set of Windsor chairs that needed the spindles re-glued and tightened, a rocking horse that had belonged to someone's grandmother and had sat damaged in a shed for 30 years. These jobs paid less than new construction. But they were steady and they were interesting, and they brought people into the workshop who spread the word further. She learned something she had not expected. The act of restoring something, bringing it back to function from damage or neglect, affected people differently than new work did. When she handed back the restored blanket box, the woman who had brought it stood holding the lid, opening and closing it, her face doing something complicated. It was my grandmother's, she finally said. I'd given up on it. Fern understood that completely. She didn't say so. She just handed the woman her receipt and let the moment be what it was. The property dispute resolved itself in April, not with drama but with paperwork. The Dunmore Mill Trust, which had been under new administration since January after Haverford Pitts retired to Dartmouth under circumstances no one in Dunmore fully explained to each other, but everyone privately understood, sent a letter to Vera Corthay's solicitor, acknowledging the historical validity of the Corthay land claim and withdrawing the trust's objection to the lease arrangement. Vera received the news with the expression of someone who has waited a long time for an obvious truth to be officially confirmed. She told Fern by way of a note delivered to the cove shed. They've given in. You may now operate without looking over your shoulder. I shall expect my dollar at the usual time. Fern pinned the note to the wall above the workbench, below the spokeshave which she had moved to a hook on the beam, where she could see it from anywhere in the shed. The reckoning with the Mill Trust when it came was not the confrontation she might have imagined in the darkest weeks of November. It was quieter and more complete. By the time the new trust administrator, a younger man who seemed genuinely embarrassed by the Pitts era, came to speak to her about a commission for new joinery in the mill office building. Apparently aware that she was now the best joinery shop within a reasonable distance, she was in a position to quote him a price without negotiation. She did. He accepted it. She completed the work and was paid promptly. No one mentioned the $40. She did not bring it up. She bought the Cove property outright from Vera Corthay the following spring, for a sum that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had stood in the cold above the cooperage, reading a letter about $40 and a gesture of goodwill. Vera named a fair price, and they agreed on it over tea, and Vera signed the deed with the precision of someone who has been waiting a long time to make a particular thing official. "It's a good building," Vera said. "The foundation is sound." "I noticed that the first day," Fern said. Vera looked at her with those pale blue eyes. "Most people walk past it and see a ruin." She picked up her teacup. "Aldrich saw things the same way you do, you know. Not what something is, what it could carry." Fern thought about Aldrich's spokeshave, the dogwood handle, her initials pressed into the wood. She thought about a folder of commission letters that had become a log of a year, then 2 years, then the record of something she had not had a word for until she realized it was hers. She thought about what it meant to be taught well by someone who understood that knowledge was the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away at 14 days' notice. "I know," she said. She kept the Cove workshop for the rest of her working life. She added to the building twice: a lean-to-kiln shed for drying green lumber in the 2nd year, and a proper showroom in the 5th, when the commissions had grown to the point where people needed a place to sit and look at samples and talk through what they wanted. She hired 2 young people over the years, one of them, a girl of 16, who had been let go from the mill laundry, and who showed up with the particular look of someone who has decided to ask for something they are not certain they deserve. Fern gave her a square of rough ash and told her to plane it flat. She worked at it for 3 hours without being asked to stop. She turned out to be extraordinary with inlay. Fern never stopped keeping the commission folder, even when the operation outgrew it. It stayed on the corner of the workbench, thick with papers by the end, the original entries in Aldrich Vane's careful hand still visible at the back, his notes interleaved with hers, the way wood grain runs through a joint. Different, but holding together. The spokeshave stayed on the beam above the bench, where she could see it from anywhere in the shop. We think about Fern Calloway sometimes when we hear the word inheritance, what it means, what form it can take, how little it sometimes looks like what it turns out to be. A $40 dismissal, a folder of names, a ruined shed with a sound foundation and the light of the south-facing cove in the morning. A man who handed a girl a rough piece of wood and said, without exactly saying it, "Let's see who you are." She was the woman who built something the world had not offered to build for her, and she kept it. What we find ourselves wondering, and what we'll leave with you, is this. When someone hands you a tool and teaches you how to use it, truly teaches you, what does that make them? And what does it make you when the time comes to use it alone?